Good morning, everyone, and thank you for waking up with me on Up with India. Today, I'll be joined by a special guest, Chandra Pitts, the founder of One Village Alliance, a global social justice agency with a mission dedicated to the development of marginalized youth through education, economic development, and the arts. Chandra's here with me today to discuss the work that her organization is doing to fight against racial inequality and violence in Delaware and around the world. Welcome to the show, Chandra. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thank you so much, India. I'm really excited to be here. It's an important time.
It's certainly an important time. My heart is a little heavy still, but I want to get right into this conversation with you. What caused you to want to get into the work of public advocacy and social justice, Chandra? If you could start there.
I'll be honest, India, it was because of my own personal experiences growing up and experiencing racism and inequity in education, and also experiencing the kind of assets and the cultural pride and the self identity, knowledge, and awareness, and the true history of myself, my family, our people, where we came from as an Indigenous people. So, understanding the hurt and harm that could be caused by those negative things, but also understanding the assets and experiences and access that my family and my community built in a village, and making sure that I was surrounded by that to really enable me to thrive in life from an early age. So seeing that a lot of youth during that time when I was a child, and then growing up, and particularly when I became an adult, seeing that there were such equity gaps, so many instances of injustices happening in every space, every day, it really made me want to do something about it. And early in life, my heroes became people like, Malcolm X, and my mom, who was an advocate for individuals in the Mexican community, and people just, Dr. Martin Luther King, who dedicated and gave their lives to social justice.
When did you actually found One Village Alliance? And you talk a little bit about your ethnic background, your community, all of that being a part of the reason why you started it. But when did you start it, and where did you start?
I founded One Village Alliance right here in Wilmington, Delaware, so in the Delaware Valley. And soon after that, really expanded into South Jersey and Southern Pennsylvania. That was in 2009. 2010 was our very first program year. And in 2020, we're just wrapping up our 10th year, which is a huge benchmark for us as a young Black first generation Mexican American girl who had a dream, a vision, and really a calling over my life that so many people believed in, supported, and joined on this journey with me.
You said that Martin Luther King Jr. was one of your inspirations for the work that you do. You have an initiative called Raising Kings. Let's get into that and talk about that work that you do and why it's so important at a time like this.
It's critical work to redefine, really just to change society's prominent image, expectations, and outcomes for men and boys of color. There's this affirmation that is resounding across the nation and around the world right now that says that Black Lives Matter. But when we look at cities like Wilmington, Delaware, and we see a data statistic today in 2020 that says a young Black child, a child in general, is 6 times more likely to be the victim of gun violence, we have to do something. That has to tap into our humanity, that we know that children are so endangered. And when we started the Raising Kings initiative in 2012, it was a record breaking year for gun violence here in the city of Wilmington, Delaware. Every single victim, except for one who was a young mother, was a young Black male. And all of the heroes and those in the media and everybody that, youth looked up to were young Black men who, depicted these, either incarceration, drug use, alcohol, violence, misogyny. So we really wanted to change those images. Every image that the media was portraying to our children was influencing their life goals and aspirations. Psychology tells us that the greatest, factor that shapes the human beings that we become are the images that we see. So when we're seeing death, destruction, and incarceration, and then we talk to a room full of third and fourth grade little boys, and they all want to either be an athlete or a rapper, there was a big need to just, not even reshaping the images and the narrative, but really tearing down these lies that Black men are going to end up one of two places by the time they're 25, tearing down all of the imagery and all the messages that speak that lie over an entire population of American children, and really elevate the level of positive male engagement in the lives of youth, and have them see, attorneys and business owners and educators and leaders of all in all spaces, inventors, creators, writers, journalists. It was very important that we just bring that truth about who we really are to light for our men and boys of color.
How has that initiative, the work that you started, directly impacted the young men that you work with? What are some of the responses that you've received from them since starting this work?
Well, one, we've seen, this program started at Ferris School for Boys. There's 5 institutes just in Wilmington where youth, children under 18, are incarcerated. Ferris is one of those, and we've been on the Ferris campus since 2012. And we started, it just so happened that year, President Barack Obama was inaugurated for the second time, and it fell on Dr. Martin Luther King Day. That was the very first day of the Raising Kings Conference. We saw an outpouring of intrigue, which was very interesting and sad, because as we're telling young men and boys who they are and who they have the capacity to be, and showing them not just the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, who's already 2 to 3 generations removed from our boys and even our generation, but we're showing them a new generation of who Black men are, all the way up to the President of the United States of America. And then we surrounded them by individuals like Wally Rushdan, who's an attorney here. Bill Allen, who's an entrepreneur and business mogul here. They just are, I'll never forget something that one of the young men said, who said, no one has ever talked to us like this. Like, we never knew there was true greatness. We believe that we're just gonna, what is there really to live for if you're gonna end up dead or in jail? And everybody we know who's growing up in extreme poverty, in these high poverty neighborhoods, because, criminality comes out of poverty. And we know the data shows us that poverty is one of the primary forms of violence. So just that intrigue that, wow, like no one's ever told us these, that there was greatness within us. We've never seen greatness. We didn't know that there were people we can, see, talk to, and touch, who are right here, who grew up in the East Side, who grew up in Southern New Jersey and Chester, Pennsylvania, and Wilmington, Delaware. We didn't have to fly speakers, and we intentionally didn't fly national speakers in from California and, Chicago and different places around the country. We want youth to know that right here, from the communities where you're from, there is greatness within you, and you affirm it, and we plan with you to truly walk in your purpose and walk into that true greatness and be successful.
I completely agree with you on that. The fact that representation matters, Chandra. I think it's important for people to see imagery. I think it's important for people to see others in roles that inspire them, and make them
Definitely.
want to do better for themselves and do better in their lives. I think that's awesome that the Raising Kings initiative was started. Having something like the Raising Kings initiative, which again, you've utilized to uplift young Black men. When you see images of men, Black men, being killed in the media, not just by each other, but by police officers, what does that feeling feel like? What does that mean to you?
First, I would say outrage. We are coming out of, and still in this, just hundreds of years of a society that is beating us over the head at every turn with this message that Black lives don't matter at all. And, you know, the outrage has to provoke us to fight. And, you know, I heard something said just before I started this organization that said, you know, the village doesn't exist anymore. And that is not true. We're here, um, we're hurting, we're strong. I think that people feel like one person can't make a difference. The greatest we can ever be individually is strong. You know, we can have a strong voice, like the voice that you and I have found. We can have a strong commitment to our purpose, like the one that we're working in, that we're walking in, but only together can we be powerful. So my commitment has been to really to call the village together, and the assertion that it truly does take a whole village to raise a, a, a child, to raise a family, and to raise a community. And as a society, one part of humanity can't thrive while the other dies. We're going to have to either rise or fail together. So being able to see the work that's come out of Raising Kings, that we've seen a 40% decrease in the incarceration rate of the boys who are detained in Ferris, has been a huge outcome. That we have been able to match mentors who are men, because of the devastation and the tearing apart of families through mass incarceration and police brutality, and so many other factors, violence and poverty. We're seeing men who never thought they even had the capacity to pour into a young man's life and to be a mentor, to be able to start the healing process and reach back and uplift the next generation. We've seen boys who people saw as hardened to really be reached by brothers from their own community who they respect. So we've seen gains that even national mentoring organizations who would tell you that Black men don't mentor, we've seen gains that even those organizations have not seen. And we've taken a very community based approach. So long after One Village Alliance is or is not funded, our programs end. These are relationships that we're building within families, between fathers and sons, between uncles, and, you know, even peer mentoring between peer groups, and among people who live in our own communities, who have been able to overlook these young men and what's happening to men and boys of color for so long, and to be able to look at the victims of violence and shooting and police brutality, um, who are not so willing to overlook that anymore. And, you know, most recently, we've seen another uprising that's more inclusive of humanity, when we've seen, you know, individuals who are just jogging through a neighborhood chased down by monsters and gunned down, shot in the back, and murdered. We've seen, you know, young fathers and brothers and sons with a knee on their neck, you know, that we've had to watch the life taken from them, from the monsters and murderers who embody racism and who embody everything that this nation was built on. We're seeing a nation look in the mirror and say, we have to make some changes.
Mhm. The state of race relations has always been an important topic. And since the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, things have truly escalated. Do you think that this will just be a bubble that will burst? Or do you think that this will lead to real reformation and real changes that'll start to happen in the justice system? What do you think, Chandra?
And you know, when we talk about Breonna Taylor and we talk about George Floyd, people are saying, you know, there's this rise and there's this new police brutality issue, but it's interesting that we forget, and, you know, where we are and what we've lived through as a people and as a nation. If you think about the Children's March, and I'm not talking about the one a couple years ago where there was a mass shooting and some white children were victimized. I'm talking about the original Children's March that really was part of fueling the civil rights movement. And you look at those images from before, from generations past, of police with water hoses and dogs and guns and billy clubs slaughtering and brutalizing. You see police officers with the knees on their necks of people. You see mothers and sisters and daughters like Breonna Taylor being gunned down with unhidden intention. Because what happened to Breonna Taylor was that was a murder, and it was intentional, even by the recklessness of walking into a black community and blindly shooting. But police brutality and even the images of police brutality are not new. It's not that America didn't see it before. So we just have to be very mindful of the fact that this is still the same America. And if your question is, am I disappointed, or am I expecting justice in the Breonna Taylor case? There was never a time that I expected justice from an American system that is so unjust, egregiously so.
Why do you think people are still shocked by the response? Even even when you heard the response, talk to me about kind of what that moment was like for you. But yeah, why do you think people are shocked, or do you think that people are just now um, looking into this more,
I,
educating themselves on this? What do you think it is?
when you look at what happened on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and that's just another example, how it really galvanized America. Even white people showed up, right? And the media came down to that bridge to, many of the photo ops we see today were not during that bloody day on that bridge, but a point where people were shocked and called to move and do something. The shock factor, I think, that we're even seeing today comes from this, it comes from a human place. I mean, it comes from this place of saying, okay, I know this is America. We know what it was built on, the torture and brutality and rape and, destruction of families and black lives, the looting of black lives and black children and black families and black communities. But surely this is not the same America. So I think there's this expectation that something about it, the heart of America has changed. And we're not willing we don't see it because there's a great level of comfort that we feel that maybe was not felt, at certain times in history. I think there's many indigenous people, black people, people of color who feel a level of comfort so that when something like this happens, they forget they forget about the injustice and the inequity that is the United States of America. And as long as we're appeased with comfort and with, college and careers and a great time and, heat and air and social media and entertainment, we're not provoked to get up and do the work that it takes to address these issues at their very core. We're
What
still
does
living.
that work look like? I mean, we've seen protests, we've seen marches, we've seen people galvanize in these ways. But do you not think that's enough? What is exactly the work that people need to start
the
doing?
work that the work that I've embarked on, and there's so many layers, but it's even multi-layered. And I know we'll talk about that a little more later. But one of the big pieces of our work are not just legislation, but really attacking systems. When people are talking about defunding the police, people don't understand what that means. When we're talking about the Constitution and, you know, dismantling, it requires dismantling the Constitution and the systems that uphold a Constitution, regardless. And it doesn't mean amending it. It means dismantling it completely, because we're still living in a nation that says a black person is not a human, is not a full human being. And as long as we're living in a nation that says that, we'll never have justice. People don't understand reparations. We have these multi-billion-dollar industries like the tobacco industry, for example. the cotton industry. And we just see, beautiful, colorful, commercials of people like making beds and running through sheets. But reparations means that those multi-billion dollar industries, a share of that rightfully belongs to the people who built those industries with their bare hands, and that is the indigenous people of this land. And I know we want easier, like, well, real time, what can we do today answers, but we'll always be showing up in court cases. And Breonna Taylor is not a rare case. We have situations of individuals who have been on camera murdered and brutalized by the police right here in Wilmington and throughout the Delaware Valley. And there has been no justice in those cases.
What message would you send to the Attorney General in Delaware? Again, you talked about this not just being a big deal on a national level, but also on a local level where there have been instances of police shootings that were investigated at the federal level and they were dismissed. So do you find that the response of state and federal government is inadequate in some of these cases? And what do you think they need to be doing at that top level?
So we need to work from what is closest to home and then work up. When we have a mayor of the city of Wilmington who is against body cameras, but we know that the police want body cameras. So it's less about, we have to work with both and. So we have to prevent incidents of brutality and police violence that happen on a daily basis in the city, things that lead to that. Police officers are on the front line of massive incarceration. We know that there's great inequity, that if you're Black, racial profiling became against the law in a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the police right in the state of New Jersey, and is because the profiling of people of color on behalf of police was highlighted in a way that was so egregious that racial profiling law is now implemented in just about every state across the nation. So locally, I think we need to have, body cameras. We need to have a public safety plan that doesn't just include downtown Wilmington and the riverfront and these places where we want to keep people safe, whose lives matter. We do affirm that all lives matter, in that we have to say that Black lives matter. So I think that that's one thing we can do. We can say to the attorney generals in our community that you have to have courage to be able to, at least bring charges against these police officers. But we also have to talk about the police unions that is this huge wall of protection that even protects police against the attorney generals and any justice. So we have to take this fight to legislative hall, not after a shooting, but right now. So everyone, who's out there protesting, rightfully so, when our lives and bodies are looted and our people are looted, we can't get angry because some windows are broken, if that's what it takes to get their attention. But only a small fraction of our protest happens out in these streets. The majority of the protest has to happen through politics. In places like the House, the Senate, the mayor's office, city council, legislative hall, we have got to be writing, influencing, and getting behind, showing up, mobilizing around public policy that's going to bring justice at the core and impact the laws of what these officers can and cannot do. If an attorney general finds that no law was broken, then we need to question what are the laws around policing.
I believe that is why the Delaware Black Caucus was created. Do you not think that they're doing enough to help with the response to some of these incidents and situations?
When we see, so if you're talking about particularly the Delaware Black Caucus, Delaware has the highest incarceration rate per capita in the entire world. 87% of the nonviolent offenders incarcerated in Delaware are Black males. Only 20% of the population in Delaware is Black man, woman, and child. And these are based on the last census statistics, a report that the University of Delaware put out, that just in the forward with done by Dr. Leland Ware. So when we look at the data, we no longer have to ask the question, do we think the Delaware Black Caucus is doing enough? This is not a new problem. This is the trend for Delaware being the highest state of mass incarceration in the world. We're seeing police brutality at astronomical rates. We're seeing the number of children killed in the number of high crime neighborhoods left completely unpoliced. And children, the homicide rate, as I spoke to in 2012, was broken. But in the very first year of this last administration in 2017, that record was broken again. This year, we have that same mayor in office, these same politicians in office, that record was broken again. And at the top of the data, we're seeing Black children. So I'd like you to ask the Delaware Black Caucus if they think they're doing enough. I don't have to put a lot of thought in it. We can just look at the numbers and the data and what it tells us about what all of us are doing, and the fact that it's not enough.
Do you think the Black Lives Matter movement is as effective as it can be?
Black Lives Matter is an affirmation that should be being shouted from the mountaintops and being led by white people. White people should be affirming that Black Lives Matter. Why are we wearing t-shirts that say stop killing us and white people not wearing shirts that say stop killing them? Can we stop killing our fellow human beings? Who cares if their skin is Black? I mean, until, when we look at the policymakers and all of our states and our nation, it is grossly predominantly white male. Those are the people who are going to, if we're in a democratic society and the only voice that really matters is the voice of people who are voting and writing this legislation through. Slowly but surely, we're growing into those places and seeping into those places, and we need to be showing up in those places and holding those voices accountable. But until white men in America join us in affirming that human lives matter, that Black lives matter, that we're not just going to stand by and focus all our resources on our beautiful downtown and our riverfront. We're going to expand our public safety plan into high crime Black neighborhoods in this city and beyond. We're going to expand the development, the millions and millions of development dollars to create beautiful spaces and safe spaces. We're going to expand that from beyond the downtown development district and the riverfront and expand them to areas of need where people matter as well. And we're going to install lighting there so that we're not just leaving children and families in the pitch dark to be further victimized. We're going to invest police resources into the detective and homicide units to solve these crimes. You have 536 shooting victims just in this administration, and there's a lot more crime happening just other than shooting. Again, the violence of poverty, but just talking about shooting victims, and over 500 still unsolved. When are we at what point do we care enough about a life to bring in the FBI? At what point do we care enough to fund the homicide unit and the detectives and really make affirmative statements through our actions and our policies and our resources that Black lives matter? Because everything that we see around us right now say without question in a very stark way that white lives matter.
Do you think that the tension right now is solely between police officers and Black and brown people, or is it bigger than that?
It's so much bigger.
We talked about Martin Luther King, we talked about Malcolm X and sort of the fight that they had, which was really again racial inequality and trying to get justice in that way. But this is kind of escalated to a different type of conversation that's a little bit more on the forefront. So for those that may be asking that question, like, is it Black Lives Matter against blue lives? Is it against all lives? What is the actual, fight or tension here?
the fight is really about humanity. And until we can really unite in humanity to affirm that a human life matters, and that human life shouldn't have to be white. I mean, we had a mass shooting a few weeks ago where 5 children in a park were shot. There was no press conference. It made the national news, but no local media covered that. And it was the second mass shooting here. The youngest shooting victim, here recently has been, we had a 6-year old shot, a 10-year-old, an 11-year-old little girl. At what point do white mothers and lawmakers and officials say, oh my God, an 11-year-old child was shot? Dr. King made a statement that said the greatest history will have to record that during our time of transition, that the greatest tragedy was not the strident clamor of the bad people, but the appalling silence of the good people. So while it's tragic, it is a tragedy when there's a human life loss. It is a greater tragedy when a life is lost and we're silent. Those who care, those who have the power, because collectively we have the power to do something about it. So I think until we can all affirm together as a human race that Black lives matter because those lives are human lives, we're not going to get anywhere. And it's definitely so much bigger than, blue lives and police officers. We actually, India, have to have a conversation and just get in a closed door room ourselves as Black people, as, indigenous, powerful um, people who came out of generations all the way from West Africa and Ghana, where we got to expand some of our work. That was such an empowering trip because we actually were not supposed to survive and we survived. So now, what do we do with that? What do we do with that survival? Do
I'm
we use that?
I'm glad that you did bring up, traveling and expanding outside of the United States. I know that you do work in Africa as well. Have you seen that the conversation in other countries is synonymous with what's happening in America? Is it just as important?
I'll tell you, affirming that Black American lives matter is a message that's being shared from as far as London, East Africa, West Africa, all across every continent around the globe. We led a social justice, our own Freedom Summer, if you will. It's called a Freedom Fellowship, which was a social justice internship. And it was curated and developed by Keenan Mann, who works with One Village Alliance, and it was led by 25 young fellows who were here from the different high poverty communities of color, but they engaged in conversation from everywhere around the world, and they're standing with us. And for people in countries who many may say is not as well off than us, to see America in such a negative light from the global perspective because of the brutality against indigenous Black African American human beings has really been something that's awakened the world and been able to show America in a really negative light. I did a interview recently with journalists from Ghana in West Africa. We talked to people in London, and one sentiment which is shared by, I just spoke to a scholar here in Delaware, and he shared that when W.E.B. Du Bois traveled here in particular to Wilmington, Delaware, he quoted W.E.B. Du Bois in saying, I met a special set of colored people in that time in Wilmington, a people who asked for little and settled for less. And that was a very profound statement. And it's being echoed by people around the world to say, we thought young Black professionals were like kind of so dope and powerful and educated. Like, are you united as young Black people in America? We see this movement happening in the streets, but kind of like, how else are you influencing what's happening as a nation politically? Because of course, politically, we're the, laughing stock of the world right now because of the leadership of this nation in many ways. Um, but I wish I could say more about how we're uniting politically, even locally, as such a powerful generation of individuals who have used our legacy to really build a great life for our beautiful individual selves. But how are we building our own legacy? Here's where the legacy of our ancestors have brought us. But how are we now going to stand in courage despite the contracts, the salary, your job, your career aspirations? How are we going to unite in courage and really campaign for the children and families who most need us in this city? Not because they're Black, but because they're dropping like flies, either through mass incarceration, inequity and justice, gun violence, poverty. There's so much work that needs to be done here, and we need to not be another generation that asks for little and settles for less.
But one of the things that the generation before us, activated themselves to fight for was voting rights. Do you still think that voting is important in 2020 as it was for them to want to fight for, in the 60s? Do you still think that's important? And why do you think so many people, or I've met, a plethora of people that are actually against voting? Why do you think that is?
Oh my goodness, being getting involved in the political process is so much more than voting. But to answer your question, yes, voting is. I mean, there is vitality in voting. Our very survival and our ability to thrive and be protected um, and valued depends on who is holding the purse strings. We can't believe in gentrification and not believe in the power of our vote. I mean, if we can look at what's happening in cities from Harlem to Philadelphia to Baltimore to Chocolate City, right? Washington. If we can see what's happening in cities at the expense of public tax dollars, even right here in Wilmington, where we're taking, and Delaware, where we have a governor, a county executive, and a mayor who are allocating dollars to um, public tax dollars, statewide and citywide, for example. Again, going back to the downtown development district, 100% of city tax dollars are being pulled from to fund a very finite area of private development. That is a call that's being made by elected officials. The chief of police, body cameras, where are, the fact that we could have 10 public safety Wilmington police officers on one block of the city of Wilmington to keep um, the population that's downtown Wilmington safe. But 4 blocks to the east and 4 blocks to the west of the riverfront, we have these high crime areas, and you don't run into one police officer. So we have really big power in these elected official offices that are um, changing and defining our lives from all the way to from legislative hall. Our school districts, our freedom fellows got really involved in school board elections. In some cases you have as few as 7 individuals, and the greater part of 7 is 4. So those four voices on any vote that impacts thousands, of lives, and how they are educated in their school environment and what we feel like is important, what we're teaching our kids in school. So if we if we think about election from the perspective of Biden or Trump, and let's choose the less of two evils, then I understand many people saying, what's the point? An evil is an evil. There is no such thing as the less of two evils. Um, but we can't write voting off um, to begin and end at voting for the president of the United States of America. School board elections, vital. The mayor, our county executive, our governor, our council people. Most importantly, an election that so many people miss every couple of years are our legislators. and the House and the Senate. There's very little even a president, much less a governor, can get through if they don't have the majority of the House and Senate vote. So I think more so than voting, if people understood the political process better, there would be absolutely no question to whether voting was an extremely important thing and worth our ancestors dying for, our right to vote.
There were allegations during the primary elections of voter tampering and things of that nature. Do you think when children, because you work with youth, when you think that when they hear things like that, do you think that it discourages them from wanting to be a part of the
Absolutely.
voting process?
Absolutely. And it's very intentional. So there was not just allegations, there's actually evidence in the city of Wilmington that polls where hundreds of people, voter machines where hundreds of people showed up to all day. There were witnesses that those polling machines showed zero votes. When there are tactics to suppress the vote, when there's fraud involved in election, it doesn't just make a statement to youth. It makes a huge statement to people. And we should be outraged, we should be acting, and we should be calling for those federal laws that were broken for people to be held accountable and for there to at least to be an official federal investigation launched into what happened during the primary elections here in the city of Wilmington. It was a critical election. So I know for a fact that there's evidence of one polling place opening 3 hours late. That's evidence. That polling place, people are supposed to have the right to vote, and that time between 7 and 9 a.m. is critical time. So for a polling place to open 3 hours late and another polling place to have a machine that everyone knows hundreds of voters cast their ballots on to produce zero, that's called evidence of voter suppression, voter fraud, and tampering.
How do you
And
think
there's
that's going to directly impact communities?
it has a great impact. Who our mayor is, who our elected officials become. Um, that should be a sacred process. The process of voting, it should be private and sacred and held to a higher standard. The Department of Elections should be held to a higher standard in holding that process very sacred. And this is just the beginning. I mean, we have another election that's just as critical coming up in November, and our primary election wrongs have not been righted.
There's so many components that go into the solution that I hear you kind of trying to get at, which is, making sure that human life is valued at a certain value. And right now, it's obvious that it's not in many different ways. I mean, you talk about voting, you talk about, just the police presence in neighborhoods. You talk
Yeah.
about the lack of mentorship and all of these things. What do you think is going to happen next, Chandra? What is going to help to can you hear me?
Yes.
What do you think is going to happen next? What do you think is going to help bring everyone together at this time, because it's so much work to do and there's so much to get done? How are people going to start to break these things down and really get at the nuts and bolts, and get real change, happening in society?
The biggest thing, India, that people need to do in the very first step, because this can seem so big and it really is, but it's not impossible. I think about the enormous strides that the LGBTQ community has made just in our lifetime. I also think about the fact that now, because of a life that was lost or a handful of lives that were lost, now that the hands free, you can't hold your cell phone anymore, in a car. That's a law in just about every state across the United States. That significant life changing law was implemented. I think about, because of a little white girl who lost her life, we now have the Amber Alert. We have these laws because important lives have been at stake here. So I know when a people come together and unify with a common agenda, that we can make significant strides in affirming and demonstrating in the United States of America that Black Lives Matter. And the first step to do that is just showing up. The work that we do gets people to show up. And the information that we put out there via video, or that our youth did a really provocative candidates forum here. And so many people, even from the Black community, said we just didn't know. We didn't know that these things were happening. We didn't know that that was the number. We didn't know that this was such a huge issue. We didn't know that we're in such a record-breaking year, and that children are being, gunned down with no ramifications or justice here. We didn't know that there was such an inequity and resource dissemination across the city. So I think the very first step is to just be proximate. Just come out of your comfort zone, your homes, engage in an organization like One Village Alliance. The things that we do are direct service to youth. You really get to talk to and engage with youth who live the data every day. We're strengthening families, and we're influencing and mobilizing around public policy. So just being proximate with an organization like us, another community-based grassroots organization that's led by people of color, I think is a great first step. If you feel like it's not important, or you're not clear on the agenda, coming together to get informed and even influence and give your input. But until we get on a common agenda, I think there's about 20 people just in Wilmington that if we unite, and young people, our generation, could really lead significant change. I mean, if it could happen in big cities like LA and Philadelphia and Chicago and Washington, D.C., certainly we can be responsible for the gentrification of our own communities. Not just building property, but building people. But in order to do any of that, we must first get proximate with each other, proximate to the issues that are really happening all around us. We live in a place where we can take the highway and not see it. Go hang out on the riverfront in downtown, which I like to do for happy hour and dinner and live music, and really not know what's happening 4 blocks in either direction if we don't live there. But to be intentional about opening our eyes and leaning in to the problem so that we can together come up with solutions and mobilize around them.
What do you think people don't know about public advocacy and social justice work? And how would someone go about, joining the efforts to help?
People, I feel the breath be like sucked out of the room every time I sit. There's so much that people don't know. I mean, about massive incarceration here in Delaware, about police brutality, about gun violence, about the data and statistics. We're working on a documentary. We have a really powerful trailer already about how the civil rights movement and the hip hop and arts movement are so aligned. It's an extension of the civil rights movement. It's not over. So to understand that the fight continues, people don't understand that our pedagogy is our protest, that we're not just, every weekend in the streets, that most of that protest happens behind walls and spaces like the one that we're in right now, right on the north side of Wilmington, on the east side of the Wilmington. Um, so to get involved, to come into these communities, to reach out directly to me and connect with our organization is one very clear way. Um, but I think people just don't know that police brutality and what happened to Breonna Taylor and subsequent to that shooting incident in the Breonna Taylor case, there was a so much bigger injustice there. It's the same justice that we'll see in the Ahmaud Arbery case, in the George Floyd case. You know, people think that those are things that are happening across the country in another city, but they're happening right here in the city of Wilmington. There's just no press conference. It's not making the local news. In many cases, what's happening in Wilmington is making national news, but we've got to get proximate. You know, we can't just let these big news platforms tell our stories and use the remote to turn it off. We have to use our action and our intellect and our degrees and our careers and our relationships our network, our mentors, and our mentees to really affect change. And there's some clear ways that we have developed to do that through our organization and the work that we're doing to demand justice. We're at that place. We're no longer asking.
Will we see a lot of that through the initiatives that you've already started, like Raising Kings, like Girls Can Do Anything? Will we see
Yeah.
a lot of that messaging in place in those places?
Absolutely. Girls Can Do Anything was founded to redefine womanhood and what it means to be a girl, to address injustices of patriarchy and racism and gender inequity everywhere it exists. So, but we have through Girls Can Do Anything and Raising Kings, they're not just annual conferences that are coming up, but they're year-round initiatives that continue to engage the next generations of leaders and connect them to the generations who've come before them, myself, yourself, and our elders included. It's to give them knowledge of self because that's what's going to propel them, and give them the fortitude for them to understand how resilient beyond everything that they're facing in their day-to-day lives. So we're going to continue to do that work. The Freedom Fellows were in our very first cohort of the Freedom Fellowship. And these are young activists and really powerful voices in all of these spaces of injustice. And we've seen some really extraordinary strides. They got involved in the school board elections and our local elections. We saw some great wins. We have, awesome. Um, we were able to really topple that. So many people who have been sitting in political seats for so long. We've seen young Black women, a young Muslim sister, some really powerful young brothers from our generation take those seats in this last primary election. There's more to come in the general election. So there's real action and real grassroots momentum and movement and building of a power base happening. Um, it's the only thing other than seeing your beautiful face this morning that's really smile in light of the pain. And sometimes, India, it's really hard to smile. I mean, the world has seen what many people in my personal life have never seen this year. And that is, tears flowing down my face. It's been so emotionally and mentally and physically um, draining and arresting, the things that we've seen just in the last 12 months and what we've seen magnified in the last 6 months through COVID. We've seen so many families who were living in a state of emergency long before this pandemic. And it's only gotten worse in many cases, but there's real movement. And do I think that we're going to win? Ultimately, we have to. We have to win. There is going to be a win for humanity at
So,
the end of this.
so I guess you are hopeful. I mean,
I am.
at the same time that we're seeing, cases of Breonna Taylor's and George Floyd's and Ahmaud Arbery's and Tamir Rice's, we're also seeing the young leaders that you work with that are rising up to the cause. So are you more hopeful than you are discouraged by what's happening in our current climate?
I wouldn't call it hopeful. I would call it undying persistence and a fight that I know just won't stop. And again, that's going to begin as an internal. It has to not begin because this is far from the beginning, but we have to continue to remind each other. Again, there's a good number of young people from our generation that I am compelled to reach out to say, yo, do you not recognize the power we have if we stay the course together? It's bigger than your job, your salary, your contract. It is our children's lives that are at stake. I'm not so much hopeful. I feel like the persistence and the data and what we're feeling and seeing in our communities, if I could just um, provoke people to get proximate enough to see it, there's no way they can turn their backs and go back into their cubicle and their offices and their workspaces and ignore it. So I looked up the definition of hope one day, and I don't think there's a lot when we look out to be hopeful for, but there's so much that we have to continue to fight for. I think the hope has led us to where we are right now. We now have to turn the hope and even the prayers into fierce, undying, unrelenting, um, provocative action.
Do you think that what you described as the hope is the reason why we are sort of still fighting the same fight? I was looking at a post on social media, and it showed that the day that the officer that was announced that the officer would be charged with only one count of wanton endangerment, that on that very same day, Emmett Till, the people that killed him, were acquitted, right? And so we're kind of still dealing with the same conversation. Do you think it's because of people are only relying on hope and prayers?
I think that the reason we're here 65 years to the day later, again, and that's why I started this conversation, not with talking about Breonna Taylor, but yes, the Emmett Tills, those children in the Children's March. We talk about Emmett Till as if that was a rare case, and it was not. Do you know the children that were brutalized and murdered and lied on and slaughtered and drugged and hung? The children. Um, yes, I think it's because of our fierce dedication to hopes and prayers and our unwillingness and our lack of courage to act. And that's not by at the fault of our own. We have been so downtrodden and oppressed and stripped down and lied to for so long. We've been told we're going to end up dead or in jail. We've been told that, there's this black maternal health where black mothers don't care about their babies as much as white mothers. We've been lied to so much, which is why Raising Kings and our Affirmative Girls Can Do Anything program to show these youth, not just tell them, but show them who we really are, for all of us to rise up as leaders and confront ourselves, and then build a power base that can truly be a force in the world. That is the only thing that's going to get us there. The only place hope has gotten people is to shock and disappointment yesterday. I didn't even turn on the news. You asked how I felt when I heard that verdict. I haven't heard it yet, India. You just said some stuff that I hadn't heard. I intentionally, on that day, because that day was not an accident, I intentionally didn't turn on social media, news, any outlet that day, because our work must continue. And we're overlooking things happening right here on the streets of Wilmington, Delaware, to be outraged and lend to a national and global outcry about Breonna Taylor. And Breonna Taylor, Breonna Taylor and Emmett Till's Black life mattered just as much as the Black lives of our children, our young men, our fathers, our daughters, our mothers and sisters that are being looted, broken, and bleeding out on the streets of cities like Wilmington, Delaware every day, with silence as the response. That's where we need to start, right in our own communities.
What has been your plan to retain the youth into your programs to ensure that they stick with what it is that you're suggesting that would help, continue to develop them and their communities? What has been your plan to retain these youth?
The primary plan that we enacted, and we're one of the only youth centers in the city. There are, I'm sure, are others, but was to open our doors. So it was never an option to keep our doors closed. So it was to open those doors. It was to pivot. The plan is to pivot from, we're still a social justice agency, but not merely mentoring and education, while those things are very important, but to really enhance every program with an economic development foundation. So we created paid jobs, much higher than minimum wage, for youth. And we put a program out there. We had over 200 applicants. And we were able to engage even during a time of the pandemic and the shutdown and no gatherings. We um, acquired furniture where not only every youth didn't just have a desk and a chair, but a whole sofa. So we furnished this building with very little to no resources, um, to make sure that it was a space that up to 40 youth could safely gather, and we could keep our doors open every single day to provide a safe haven. We reached out to corporations. I'm really excited about our funders and our corporate partners who said enough is enough, not just this pandemic and the new families that are in a state of emergency, but we want to contribute to those families who have lived in these conditions and far worse, and we're dying at much higher rates than COVID-19 could ever produce. Um, but also the social injustices. We want to put our money where our mouth is. And these are white corporations and foundations who affirmed with us and reached out to us to say that we were looking for organizations led by people of color. We want to begin to take our approach. You know, if you look at how organizations led by people of color are funded in comparison to white led organizations, the inequity and injustices even span the area of philanthropy in embarrassing ways. We're talking about 90% higher funding um, for white led organizations, even organizations who are funded to do work with children from Black communities. But we see those partners reaching out to us to commit. So our plan includes to continue to meet the goals and the outcomes, to provide a safe haven space, to keep our doors open no matter what, by any means necessary. Our plan is to continue to build the cohort of Freedom Fellows and to continue to build our cohort of volunteers and people who just want to give and pour into. It's not just money, it's your time, your talent, your treasures. We had a volunteer the other day come and do the landscaping and yard work with some of our Freedom Fellows. So we want to continue to keep our youth engaged in meaningful, gainful employment opportunities, social justice advocacy. They have become activists, and learning opportunities when schools and public libraries and community centers remain closed. Our plan is to, if it has to be 7 days a week, 6 days a week right now, to keep these doors open and to continue to expand our global reach to youth, even in West Africa, and our 240 schools there who, 240 schools there who, where we have youth who are, have just great capacity and potential, but we want to continue to pour in. So we're going to keep working and keep engaging all of the people who are now just coming into the newfound knowledge of the egregious injustices here in Wilmington, Delaware, throughout the Delaware Valley, throughout the state, and well beyond, and creating opportunities for those people to join with us and work with us to build a power base and to be a force in bringing justice for children and families.
For Delaware locals that are unsure of where you are located, could you share that information and again how they can find you and get more information about your organization?
We acquired a sprawling 10,000 square foot indoor-outdoor COVID compliant space in partnership with UAME, which was founded by a great freedom fighter and ancestor, Peter Spencer. And we're located right here at 31 West 31st Street, which is close to 31st and Market, close to the corner there. But people from all over the world, all over the region can get involved in so many ways just by visiting our website at iamthevillage.org. It's an affirmation, iamthevillage.org. You can reach out to us at 855-YOUTH-ED. That's 855-YOUTH-ED. And you can email us directly at family@iamthevillage.org. But we need you. It's our time to not only hope, not only pray, but to really act for justice. And it truly does take a whole village to raise a child. And together we are the village.
Thank you so much, Chandra, for taking the time out. Sit down with me and have this serious conversation. Very, very necessary. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much, India. It was a pleasure.
Thank you to everyone who was watching. You guys can continue to follow us on social media at WITN22 Wilm, and I'll wake up with all of you tomorrow morning. Bye-bye.